know about these 7 Serger tips, and yet they're not often talked about. So let's talk about it. This video is created in partnership with Brother, and I've been testing Brother Airflow 3000 Serger that you see behind me. To get familiar with the Serger, I've been reading the manual, and I wanted to share a few tips that will be very helpful when working with your Serger. So let's start with tip number 1, is that you can actually do backstitching on your Serger. Now on sewing machine, it's very clear how to do backstitching because we have that special lever. There is no special lever on Serger, but there is a technique how you can do backstitching. So to do the backstitching at the beginning of the seam, I want you to go ahead and do about 5 centimeters of thread chain. Then you go ahead and slip the fabric under the presser foot and create a few stitches. Raise the presser foot and bring that thread chain in the front and slightly pull it towards you. Lower the presser foot and start stitching. After a few stitches, cut off the excess thread chain with a knife and then continue sewing your seam. In this way, you have created the back stitching at the beginning of the seam, and the seam will not fall apart. To do back stitching at the end of the seam, I want you to do extra stitch past the fabric edge. Lift the presser foot, the needles also should be in the up position, and flip the fabric. Lower the presser foot and make a few centimeters of back stitching. Here, important part is not to cut off any excess fabric and not to cut off the threads from the first seam. After a few stitches are done, drive the fabric away and cut off the excess thread ends. And this is how you created a very secure back stitching of the end of the seam. Usually when sewing with Serger, I like to begin and end my seam by leaving long thread tails and then bringing them back to the seam using a big dull needle. But the backstitching method also works, so give it a try and see which method works best for you. Tip number 2 is actually the request from viewer. She wrote and asked how to position fabric on Serger. So this is the method that I like to use. First, I take the sewing gauge and I measure the width of the Serger seam that I will be using. In this case, the width of my Serger seam is 5 millimeters. Usually on patterns for knit fabrics, the seam allowance will be 1 centimeter. So when I'm using 5 millimeter stitch width, I have to cut off 5 millimeters of seam allowance when serging. Now look at your serger, and at the metal plate there should be a line which indicates where the knife will be cutting the fabric. So I position the fabric so that the 5 millimeters are going past that knife line, meaning those 5 millimeters will be cut off when serging. And when serging, I pay full attention to that part where the fabric is being cut to make sure that I'm cutting off equal amount of seam allowance throughout the seam. Tip number 3 is that you can deactivate the knife on your serger. So all sergers have the function to deactivate the knife and stop it from cutting the fabric when doing overlocker seam. In this particular Brother Airflow 3000 model, it's very simple. At the bottom we have a lever and we just simply push it if we want to deactivate the knife. When the knife is deactivated, it's just not moving and not cutting the fabric when you're sewing. Now, knife is activated or deactivated differently depending on the serger model that you're using, so it's best to look at the serger manual and see how the knife is deactivated in your particular machine. Knowing how to deactivate the knife will be very useful if you don't want to cut the fabric and you simply want to create an overlocker seam. Tip number 4 is you can actually adjust the presser foot pressure. At the top of your serger, you should see either a knob or a screw, and this will allow you to adjust the presser foot pressure. So the normal setting on this particular serger is 2. 2. Now when we loosen the tension of the presser foot, let's say to 1, this means that it's pressing the fabric a little bit lighter. This will be very useful if you're sewing very lightweight fabrics that tend to pucker, and adjusting the presser foot pressure might help avoid that puckering. Also, when the presser foot is pressing the fabric lighter, it will make it easier to sew curves. When sewing very heavy fabrics, you may want to tighten that screw to, let's say, position 3, so that the presser foot is pressing the fabric tighter. This is not the adjustment you have to do often, but when you're working with very lightweight fabrics or very heavyweight fabrics or sewing curves, remember that adjusting the presser foot pressure might help sew better. Tip number 5 is about differential feed. Now, not all sergers come with differential feed, but if yours does, this can be very handy. So what is differential feed? Under the presser foot, you see metal teeth, which are also called feed dogs. When you're sewing, they are moving and they're feeding fabric through the presser foot. Now, when the serger has differential feed, it means that it comes with 2 sets of feed dogs, the front feed dogs and the back feed dogs. When the differential feed is deactivated or set on 1, this means that both feed dogs are moving at the same time. Let's take an example and use this very lightweight knit fabric and sew it on our serger using a deactivated differential feed. And you can see that the seam is slightly gathered and is puckering. Now let's reduce the differential feed ratio to 0.7. This means that the front feed dogs are moving slower than the back feed dogs, resulting in a bit stretched seam. So let's sew the same lightweight knit fabric using reduced differential feed ratio, and you can see that the seam is now flat and the fabric is not gathered. This is because when we're serging with reduced differential feed ratio, the seam is slightly stretched and it eliminates that puckering and that gathering. Now let's do a different experiment and let's increase the differential feed ratio to 2. This means that now the front feed dogs will be moving twice the speed of back dogs, resulting in a slightly gathered seam. So when we sew the same very lightweight knit fabric, you can see that the seam is really gathered. So increasing differential feed ratio will be very beneficial when you see a wavy seam, and increasing differential feed ratio will help eliminate that waviness. So if your serger comes with differential feed, using different ratios will help sew different fabrics much easier and get better results. Tip number 6 is this mysterious net that most likely came with your serger. This net is used to control threads that just keep unwinding. Now, you don't have to use it on all serger threads because most likely they're staying on a cone pretty well. But if you want to sew, let's say using loosely spun nylon thread, it just will keep unwinding. So in this case, put the thread net over the cone, put the thread in the right position, and the thread will not be unwinding off the cone. So don't throw away that weird looking net because it might come very useful in the future. 7th tip is you can actually use different presser feet on your serger and extend the possibilities that you can do with your serger. So it's very common that we use different presser feet on the sewing machine, but on sergers, they're usually not that often talked about. Using different presser feet on your serger may help do certain tasks faster. For example, you can use an invisible stitch foot, or you can use a gathering foot on your serger to create and attach gathers. You can also get a piping foot, which will allow you to install piping without having to use a sewing machine. There are also beading feet, there are also elastic feet, so quite a few feet to choose from and extend the possibilities of your serger. So here are the 7 tips I wanted to share today, but I have a bonus tip. When reading the manual for this particular serger, I found the setting record table. So when you're working with different fabrics and you do all these adjustments to find the perfect seam for that particular fabric, you most likely adjust the thread tension, you select the right size of the needles, you may be adjusting the pressure of the presser foot, you may be using differential feet, so you're changing all those settings on your serger. So when you do that, just mark it down in the table like this one, and next time when you're working with same fabric or similar fabric, you will already know what to do to find the perfect setting for your serger. So here are all serger tips I wanted to share today, and I would love to hear your best serger tip, so leave it in the comments. While testing Brother Airflow 3000, I created this sweater you see behind me, and on my Instagram I will be sharing a lot of tutorials on how I created this sweater. I will be showing how to create a cuff with a thumb hole, I will show how to add a zipper at the side and how to shorten a metal zipper. I will show how I create the shibori bubbles and attach them to the sweater, and how I attached elastic to the shoulders to prevent them from stretching out. So quite a few tutorials, and if you're interested to see them, I will link my Instagram page in the description box down below. Thank you so much for watching today, and I will see you next time. Bye!